I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello Horror Hounds and welcome to my horror house. It's another request review, this time from the inestimable Jambo Shango. He and Randy Mole have already reviewed this movie quite recently as part of their new King of Kings season. I'll link to their review down below. It's a 1983 film from director Lewis Teague, who directed the amazing B-monster movie Alligator, which I reviewed ages ago. I'll pop up a little link at the end of this to my review of Alligator. It's a movie that's well worth checking out. But for this go-round, Lewis Teague is adapting Stephen King's novel of A Good Dog Gone Bad. It's Cujo. Is there anyone out there who doesn't know what Cujo is about? The word Cujo has now entered pop culture and is synonymous with A Good Dog Gone Bad. And both novel and film hang themselves on a very effective little hook, an incredibly simple premise of a St. Bernard gone rabid who traps a mother and her child inside an isolated car without food or water during a heat wave. It's what everyone knows about the story, it's what everyone wants to see from the story, but before we can get to that, we have to traverse the almost interminable first half of the film. We get to see a young Tad afraid of the imagined monsters in his closet, and underneath his bed we get to see Tad's mum, Donna, expertly played by Dee Wallace, trying to extricate herself from an affair with a former high school boyfriend, Steve Kemp. And thrillingly, we get to see Donna's husband Vic's business trip to save an ad campaign for a line of children's cereals. Alongside this are the Cambers, a mechanic and his family who own Cujo and who subscribe to the thumbnail sketch school of characterization of Stephen King at his absolute worst. A bunch of basically soap opera stuff happens for about 45 minutes until we get to Donna and Tad inside the broken down Pinto and the snarling, slobbering Cujo outside. And there's no real correlation between the first half of the movie and the second half. There's no direct line drawn between transgression and punishment unless you want to subscribe to the school of thought that suggests that poor innocent Cujo was damned and 3 people killed to act as some kind of avatar of divine justice against Donna for breaking her marriage vows. That's a depressingly Old Testament worldview which I'm convinced King doesn't subscribe to. So we're left with an almost equally depressing existential situation where random bad shit just happens. And yet, strangely, there are moments where the film tries to persuade us to see meaning in the random. Right after the opening scene where Cujo chases a rabbit and encounters the bat whose bite gives him rabies, we jump across to Tad facing his nightly terror of the thing under the bed, the thing inside the closet, and we see in the background of his bedroom a stuffed St. Bernard's dog and a stuffed rabbit, sort of stuffed toys of the scene we've literally just seen. And I don't know what that's about. Is the film trying to suggest that their meeting is fated, destined to happen? And if so, why? What's Tad ever done? The score also seems to underline and hammer home this sense of fate, immovable destiny. Do we really need an ominous French horn riff every time Cujo appears? First off, when his name appears on the title card, and then when we first see him as a perfectly happy, healthy St. Bernard plodding onto the screen, this ominous musical riff happens. The same when Donna first sees Cujo. Sure, he's already been bitten, but he's perfectly friendly, affable, lovable family dog, and yet she gets a sort of frisson, a sort of shiver off of him, a psychic sense. Almost, the film is trying to tell us that they'll meet again, but this collision course of destiny doesn't make sense. It all seems to be implying some kind of inevitability, a fatalism that Cujo will turn rabid and kill, that is chugging us towards a sort of sense of Greek tragedy. But the film doesn't ever go so far as to say that these are punishments for a transgression or a hubris. It's just a bunch of random stuff. Maybe only in Donna's own head might this seem as a punishment, but nowhere else in the narrative, even though the film makes all these attempts to set the events up as such. And the fault for this may lie in the source material, the novel. Even Stephen King really doesn't seem to know. He's very candid about how much he was drinking at the time he wrote Cujo, and that he can't even remember writing the book. And these inconsistencies show in the source material. He starts out the novel hinting at a supernatural force shaping these events, and ends by confirming that Cujo was a good dog who just got rabies. End of story. But there's all this weird shit about the darkness of the spirit of Frank Dodd, the cop serial killer from The Dead Zone, one of his interlinking things that King likes to do in his novels. And it's strongly implied that Dodd's spirit is at turns directing the rabid Cujo and also haunting, I shit you not, Dad's closet. But even in the novel, all of this is jettisoned towards the end, never resolves into anything, and it's just a weird sort of hanging chad of a plot point that makes no sense. So we have a very sparse story where, at least in prose form, King is able to inhabit Donna's mind while she and her son are trapped, and we get to follow her internal monologue. In prose, time like that can be dilated in this sort of ship in a bottle scenario. In the film, Teague has no such luxury, so we dawdle for 45 minutes and then get to the meat of the story, the bit that we all want to see. I think if you were going to be adapting Cujo now, it would work so much better as an hour-long, maybe episode of Masters of Horror or something like that than a full-length feature. And I do cynically wonder whether this story would have been optioned for a feature film if it hadn't had Stephen King's name attached to it. The scenario of the mother and son trapped in the car is the selling point, and it's also the point at which the film begins to soar. It's the kind of scenario, and I think other films do this, I'm thinking maybe stuff like 47 Meters Down, where part of the enjoyment of the film is to be a backseat driver, to point out what Donna does wrong, what you do in that situation. It's a neat little horror-infused thought experiment. For the record, if it were me, I would not try to smash a car window with a loaded gun I was holding by its barrel. Which brings us to the impeccable Dee Wallace. I think Cujo stands or falls on the strength of two things: her performance and whether or not you buy into the fact that this dog has gone bad. And in both regards, I think the film succeeds in spades. Cujo is worth watching just for Dee's performance alone. Stellar, all-time Hall of Fame stuff. She manages the soap opera-y first 45 minutes with accomplished ease, and then when she's asked to go to the more feral, desperate, harrowing places in the back end of the movie, boy, she really digs down and she absolutely sells it. Ably supported by a 6-year-old who seems to be able to channel abject terror flawlessly. On rewatching this, I was convinced that the young child was being traumatized for real, but according to an older Danny Pintoro in one of the behind-the-scenes features, he wasn't traumatized at all. Working opposite them, literally on the opposite side of the windshield, is a small number of trained St. Bernard's dogs, each who can do a particular little thing: pour at a window, jump up and round the car. One that's a sort of stunt snarler that can just curl its lips on command. This, in a combination of some puppetry and even a stuntman in a dog suit, which I didn't pick out while I was watching the movie. It's only the behind the scenes stuff where they point out, and here's the stuntman in a dog suit bashing into the car door. You go, oh yeah. A combination of all of these little tricks and the makeup they use on the dogs to show his progression from a happy, fluffy St. Bernard's into a slimy, bloody, oozing, slobbery monster is handled so well that once you get to that scenario, the scenario everyone wants to see, I bought it. I was all in. I also need to give a tip of the hat to Dutch cinematographer turned director Jan de Bont. Jan de Bont, as we all know, Dutch for Jan the Bont. Maybe it's the dog's colouring, but Cujo looks magnificent when de Bont bathes him in the gold and amber colours of sunrise and sunset. And the same goes for how great Cujo looks looming out of the fog, and then in his last act of rationality, choosing not to attack his young owner, slinking back into the fog, and this is the last time where the Cujo anyone knew would be lost forever, and what comes back out of the fog is a rabidly insane beast. Everything is done very well, extremely competently. You can't point to any piece of the film which isn't produced to a good or great degree of technical skill. But I found the behind the scenes features warming me to Cujo more than a lot of the film itself. You can find I think it's called Dog Days, the behind the scenes feature here on YouTube, and I'll link to that in the description field down below. It's well worth a watch. The filmmakers discuss the technicalities of piecing together action scenes with multiple dogs, puppets and the stuntman in the dog suit, as well as the use of multiple cars with different pieces cut out of them so that de Bont could get interesting angles and get up close and personal to the pair trapped inside the vehicle. Ultimately, I think Cujo is an example of pretty great filmmaking with a story that I think had no right to be a full-length feature. The King brand, the hook, and Dee Wallace's performance have given Cujo a sheen, but it's unsurprising that this is one of the King films which doesn't get talked about much, nor does his novel for that matter. It just doesn't seem to have a bow tied around it, and I know not all stories have to resolve like that, and I know that life is a random series of events. This just seems to be a collection of things put together so that there's enough of a runtime to tell what is ultimately really a novella-length story. Plus, if you're a dog lover like me and spent any time at all thinking about that happy, loyal dog from the start of the movie and what it's put through for no reason at all, I'm sorry, Stephen, but the story kind of stinks. If there are any other specific films or kinds of films you'd like me to review, give me a shout. I'll do my absolute best to accommodate you. And if you want to hit me up a like or an unlike, apparently that really helps. And I could do with all the help I can get.